He was a hugely interesting and also, I think, a very inspiring person to be with, because he would always be looking to get the best of what he thought you had to offer. And he really believed in talent. He really believed in talent. I met him through a mutual friend, Milena Canonera, who's a wonderful costume designer, and my understanding is that she mentioned my name, to Stanley when he was setting up Clockwork Orange, and said, you should talk to this girl who works in fashion and beauty and photography.
And Stanley had asked me if I read the book. I said yes, I read the book and I liked it. But when he asked me to do the costume, you know, really I fell off my chair. And I told him right away that it was exciting but very frightening. I don't think I knew how to do it. He said, don't worry, come on Monday.
I was very much in awe, because I knew him of course by reputation, and film wasn't something I did a lot of. And he said, well, you know, would I like to come and do some experimental work with him and with Milena and with Leonard, who was a hairdresser, wonderful hairdresser. And so I said, yeah, of course, you know, I was flattered to be asked.
He wanted me to start working on the movie by helping John Barry, the production designer, to look for location. And he said, once you know what I'm looking for, once you know what kind of location we are scouting, we'll talk about the costume. So in a way, Stanley taught me right away that costume, lighting, and production design direction has to be all together. It's one thing. So he took me back to the dining room, where on the long table there was a camera, a Nikon, his own Nikon, a light meter, a tripod, and then he showed me how to use the Nikon, all very patiently, you know, because I did not know too much about cameras. And I went to look for a location more than 2 months, maybe even 3 months. Stanley wanted to see everything. We photographed hundreds of locations all around London, because Stanley, in a way, wanted to be there. So every night we all get together at his house to look at the photograph of the location, because it was very family-like.
You know, Stanley liked ideas. He wouldn't necessarily tell you especially what it is he wanted, because sometimes he didn't know what he wanted till he saw it, and the minute he saw it, he knew it was right. So his thing was, he'd sort of tell you what was in his mind in a kind of a more general way. And certainly for Clockwork Orange, there were 4 of us working in the team. So I would work closely with Milena, and we'd talk about the clothes and how it would look, and if Leonard was doing something with the hair, and how the faces would fit in. And then, of course, they had to fit the character. So Stanley would tell me how the guys were and what they were thinking about. And then we'd sort of do some visual work, which was basically doing the makeup, the hair, and then Polaroiding it. He loved Polaroid, because, you know, we all had Polaroid cameras in those days. And so we'd take pictures, and then we'd look at them. And he'd very often set up a bit of film, and we'd film it. And then he'd look at it and he'd say whether it worked or it didn't work. But he was always patient, you see. He didn't fluster you, and if it wasn't working, you know, he'd guide you into something else.
Stanley had contacted and interviewed various other costume designers who had presented him with very elaborate conceptual work, and therefore I knew that that was not what Stanley was looking for. In the meantime, I came to understand that Stanley wanted to do a movie which was very ambiguous, was based on a distorted reality of the time, a very, very near future. He wanted to do not a science fiction futuristic movie, but a moral movie, a moral tale. Learning all this gave me a great advantage. Stanley never interfered or really gave me suggestions about costumes. He always gave you suggestions which were pertinent to light. And therefore I was very free, but in a way he also gave you the direction, where to go. I was keeping my eyes open with the idea of the costume, and I also was looking at gangs, you know. Youth gangs in those days were really rampant. And I was looking at them, I was taking I was collecting photographs, I was studying all that. And Stanley kept saying to me, I want it to be real, but I also want to be unique, but also it has to be something that the Drugis could put together, something not expensive, something they could actually do it by themselves. It should not look costumey. Stanley also told me, he said, Milena, you start with the head. Don't forget the head, because that's his mainly movies, close-ups.
I said to him, why don't we try some false eyelashes? And he said, okay. Like what? And I said, well, we could try some on the top, which is, of course, where you put false eyelashes. It could, this kind of guy was the sort of person who'd do something very bizarre like that.
And there was a great selection of eyelashes on the market. But the fact that Barbara chose these long, strong eyelashes, they were very masculine. And if they'd been only thinner, if they'd been more feminine, then it would have not have worked so well.
He wouldn't have said, do this with the eyelashes. He maybe wouldn't have come up with the eyelashes at all. But that was what was great about him. You could talk to him about stuff like that, and he wouldn't say, oh, no, that will never work. He'd just say, well, let's give it a try.
When Barbara did the makeup, she put these incredible, long, fierce eyelashes on both eyes, on Malcolm. Then Barbara took one off. The way he looked with that one lash, everybody went, ah. And Stanley said, that's it, this is it.
I think the thing is, if you did things that were perhaps a bit mad and might not have worked, and I think that's the point about Kubrick's creativity, I would never worry about trying them, because if you didn't like it, say so. And if you liked it, you did. So you would try, and he'd be open to it. And he gave you the time to do it, which is a very unusual thing. So for a creative person, that's great. I mean, he wouldn't say, put a bit of blue there, put a bit of green there. I mean, he didn't work like that. All the other drugs had very odd makeup as well, blocks of colour. And they just were developed from this sort of face painting thing, because we developed this character of Alex, and Stanley said, what about the others? And I said, well, I think, these guys are doing very out there things. Because it was a tribe. They were a gang, weren't they? I mean, not many of them, but they were a gang. So they would do these tribal things. That was my feeling. And he'd say, well, what do you mean? I said, well, in face painting. And so we put blocks of colour, yellow and blue and things on the guys that they would do themselves. And that was their tribal marker.
I told him about certain things that appealed to me from various gangs. And I told him that it has to be either white or black. White like the milk bar, white because it gives you a feeling of purity, which is ironic against the black soul of these drugis. It's black because they are night gangs, because they epitomize black soul. Well, I said, so, you choose. Which one do you want, black or white? He said, let's go for white. So white was the color of the drugis.
Leonard, I think, came into the project because he too was brought in by Milena, who knew his work. And of course I worked with him a lot, so Stanley had a bit of a team going already. Leonard and I had a dialogue, because I was working with him in fashion and beauty. So we already had a creative way of working, which was kind of good for Stanley, because he didn't have two people who didn't know each other trying to provide a big creative picture for him. Leonard instigated so many things within the styles of hairdressing that I think a lot of people are doing today. I mean, he was the first person to start using all this coloured hair, which Stanley liked.
Stanley liked the idea of the look, the suspender, the American paratrooper boots. They were much more fierce than the Doc Martin, fashion boots. I also brought in a big box of hats that I rented from Berman and Nathan. And I think sometimes they give that extra thing, especially on clothes which look almost like a uniform. I wanted the boys to identify themselves, to have something quite personal. Malcolm loved right away the bowler hat. The bowler hat epitomized a gentleman, which is ironic with his character. That's why also later on the costumes are kind of revisited version of an Edwardian gentleman. The walking stick, which then turns into a blade, it's also reminiscent of an Edwardian gentleman who can also defend himself or attack.
I mean, we would have many conversations, and he wasn't a wordy guy. I mean, Stanley just didn't do chit-chat. So when you'd have a creative conversation with him, you know, we'd be just talking about why we were doing what we were doing and what he wanted.
The Mask of Pinocchio was very appropriate for me, for Alex, because not only is phallic, but Pinocchio is a liar before becoming a good boy. So again, the ingredient of surrealism is there. I learned, especially after 3 movies, but already from Clockwork Orange, that he was always trying to find, and he always found, a style for his movies that went in unison with the idea of the movie. The cinematic handwriting of his movies is very, very particular to that movie.
Inspiring other people creatively, I mean, that was what he did.